Hey guys, welcome back to Morgan Hill Farms. I was coming down to the garden today to do some work and I thought I would bring you all along with me. Right now is the time of year when everybody is thinking about growing a garden, putting a garden in, and I know that a lot of people are researching how to do that, what is the best way for them to do that, and so I thought that I would bring you guys along and just share with you a little bit about how we built this garden and some things that you guys might want to think about if you are going to be building a garden. So let's just start with an overview of my garden. This area here is about 100 feet long by about 60 feet deep, and it has approximately 52 raised beds in it. The other part of my garden is about 70 feet long by 60 feet deep, and that is my in-ground garden. Now there is a reason why I have both raised bed and in-ground gardens, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But just to give you an overall feel of the size of this garden, the footprint of it takes up just a bit less than 1/4 of an acre. But if you look at only the growing space, so only the square footage that I have within my raised beds and within my rows, that's about 3,000 square feet. And there are ways to grow that will take up less of a footprint, like using vertical techniques and things like that. We'll talk about that later. When we moved to this property, I knew that I wanted to get started on building a garden immediately. I had made my goal that we were going to grow a year's worth of food, and I wanted to get this garden built as soon as possible. So the first thing that we started looking at was location. You want to pick an area that gets good sun, at least 7 to 8 hours a day. If you're growing in a lot of shade, you're going to be pretty limited. A lot of your greens will tolerate that, but other plants like your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your melons, they really want a lot of sun. Now we get a lot of sun pretty much all over our property, so that was not an issue for us. Another thing that you want to consider is close to your house. If you have to run across your 50-acre property to get to your garden every day, you are not going to be keeping an eye on it. And at the times when dinner time is coming and you need to run down to the garden to get a few of those ingredients, you're just not going to be utilizing that garden as well as you would if it was close to your house. So this particular garden is fairly close to my house, maybe just a couple 100 feet away, which makes it really, really convenient. Another thing that you want to think about is water access. So if you're having to run a hose down to water your gardens, how many hoses do you have to string together? That is how we did it when we first built the garden. We didn't have any irrigation, and so I had to string like 3 hoses together to be able to water my plants so that they would survive in the hot South Carolina summers. The next consideration that you want to take into mind is what kind of soil do you have? So in South Carolina, we have really hard red clay. Sometimes it's hard to even get through that with a pickaxe or a shovel. So it's really, really tough and sometimes very difficult to grow in. So as an inexperienced gardener, when we put this garden in, I didn't want to fool with that. I said raised beds are the way to go for me. I want to be able to put my own soil in there and give myself the best chance of success. And so that is how we started building this garden. The first thing that we did was to make it level. Luckily, we had a box blade that was left on the property when we moved in here. And so Nate was able to take that and scrape away a good portion of the soil to make this area nice and level. It was already fairly level, but I knew if we were going to be building raised beds that I didn't want to deal with terracing beds down a slope. I didn't want to fool with special cuts. I just wanted to be able to build the boxes, build them all nice and straight, and then just set them in the places where we needed them. So most of my beds are 4 foot by 8 foot, and they're made from fence pickets that we just picked up at Lowe's. You can kind of see the dog ears here. What we did on the long side is just leave those 8-foot boards intact. And on this side, we went ahead and just cut them in half evenly. It made sense for us to go with this size because this size was going to be the cheapest way and to give us the most space. Now we used inexpensive landscape timbers in the corners here so that we actually would have something to screw into to make the box itself. We also use those landscape timbers as supports on the long sides of the bed. If you are building raised beds that are 6 feet or 8 feet in length, you definitely want to make sure that you're supporting those sides, because once you start to fill your beds, those sides will start to bow out, and you really want to keep your beds nice and straight. It's just aesthetically pleasing, and it's also good for the longevity of your bed. Now, not only do I have 4x8 beds, but I also have a few 3x4 beds, as well as some 2 foot by 16 foot beds, and those ones are for my raspberries and my blackberries, and I'm going to show you those. So these beds here are for my raspberries. My blackberries mirror this on the other side. And I knew that I didn't need a lot of space for them. In fact, they probably would have even grown in the native soil. We just did really long, narrow beds. And then we installed some T-posts and used cattle panels to make an arch to allow those plants to trellis themselves during the growing season. It keeps them up off the ground, it keeps them nice and clean, and it's easy to harvest the berries from them. So these ones work really well. And all of these raspberries, and like I said, I have blackberries on the other side, the same exact size. They provide us with raspberries and blackberries for the year. Now I also have some raised beds that are 6 foot by 3 foot. These are made of galvanized metal, which means that they're coated in zinc and they won't rust. I got these from Northern Tool when I got the idea that I was going to grow all of our food. I had put an order in, and it took them about 8 months to fulfill that order. So we had these ready to go when we moved to the property. Now these beds are not as deep as the ones that we built out of the fence pickets. So I would not plant anything like your carrots or sweet potatoes or white potatoes in here, but these things can grow so many different crops. You can do your greens, your lettuce. I've done beets, I have done garlic, onions. So these things are really, really versatile. So if you're not wanting to get out a table saw and cut down wood pieces to build your own beds, this is a really easy way to do it. You're basically just taking some nuts and bolts and assembling them. Very, very easy and quick to do. Now, when you're filling your raised beds, some people opt to put a barrier at the bottom just to keep out any moles or anything that might be tunneling under there and eating their plants from below. I did not opt to do that, and the reason for that is because even though our native soil is very hard and it's red clay, it retains a lot of nutrients. So over time, as I amend these beds and add in more organic matter and use cover crops, my hope is that the soil underneath will start to be changed over time, and my plants will then be able to penetrate that soil and get nutrients that the clay is holding down there. So what we did do was we did a nice layer of cardboard, and then we came in with sticks and leaves and logs and put those in there. And then I filled them with what's called Mel's Mix. I had done a lot of research on soil and what to use. And Mel's Mix is a very popular soil mix for square foot gardening when you're really planting intensely. And so that is what I went with. It's basically 1/3 compost, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 vermiculite. And so that is what we filled the beds with. And then each year I come in with about 1 inch to 2 inches of compost on top of that, and it has worked beautifully for us. So another option that you might be thinking about for gardening would be in-ground. So your raised beds, they can get a little bit pricey because you are having to buy that material at the store. So if you want to do an in-ground garden, this is a great option as well. The reason that I put in the in-ground garden after we had built that entire raised bed garden was because I was concerned that I was not going to have enough growing space. If I wanted to do crops like corn or bush beans or cowpeas or shelling peas, things that I needed to grow a significant amount of so that I could harvest and preserve that food for the year, I was afraid that the raised beds would really limit me on space. So the kids and I, in 1 week, installed this in-ground garden. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. You can till up the ground over a few weeks period, pull out your pasture grass or whatever weeds are growing in there, and then you can amend with some compost and plant right in that. But because I was very concerned about growing our food and very concerned about the red clay and not really knowing how to work with that, I opted for a different method. What we did is we just cut the grass very, very tight here, and then we went dumpster diving for cardboard. We went all over our town asking managers and people at stores if we could get their cardboard out of their dumpsters, and they were gracious enough to allow us to do that. It made for some really funny memories, and I don't think the kids will ever do that with me again, but they did for the time that I needed them to. So anyways, the entire area here was laid down with cardboard, and then I learned to drive the tractor, and I would come down and alternate rows of wood chips and compost, wood chips and compost. And that is essentially how we built this garden. We built it on top of the ground. Now my rows are 30 inches wide and my pathways are 18 inches wide. Typically in a market garden where you have people that are growing a massive amount of crops to bring to market to their customers, they will use a 30-inch bed. It's the most economical way to go, and it also grows a good amount of food in there. They will typically have their pathways at 12 inches. I did mine at 18 because I knew I was going to have kids in there, and I knew that Nate was going to be in there, and I just wanted everybody to be comfortable in the garden. And honestly, I didn't want to have to worry about everybody trampling on my rows and compacting my soil, and then I'm having to fix that after they're out of the garden. So I went with an 18-inch walkway, and that has worked really, really well for us. Now, the reason that we chose wood chips, there's a bunch of different options that you could choose for this, but the reason that we chose wood chips for the pathways was honestly because they were free. We reached out to a local arborist, and he brings us free wood chips whenever we want, and we always try to take them from him just to help him out. It's also a great way to make your own hardwood compost if you guys do a little research on that. So what's really nice about these wood chips is that over time they break down and they'll compost down into a nutrient-rich soil that then can help to feed your plants that are in your rows. So we just finished remulching the entire garden a couple of weeks ago, but underneath this is a nice black organic soil. So that's an added benefit to that. Now, as far as pathways in your raised bed garden, you have a few options. You could do wood chips. You could just do grass if that's what you have. That's really inexpensive, and you just come through with a lawnmower or weed whacker, to keep that in check. I would not suggest doing grass in your in-ground garden, in your walkways, because you will just be fighting that grass as it tries to grow into your rows day after day after day, and that would be very frustrating. So I wouldn't use grass here. Another option for your raised bed garden instead of the wood chips and the grass would be pea gravel. Pea gravel is beautiful. It makes for a wonderful ground cover. It's very clean, but you're going to spend some money bringing that in. That was my first choice, but because the wood chips were free, we went with that instead. And in the raised bed garden, we simply laid down sheets of landscape fabric just as a weed barrier, and then we went on with a really thick layer of wood chips. Now, speaking of pathways, in my raised bed garden, my walkways are 3 feet wide, and there's a specific reason why I did that. And that is because that is the size of walkway that I need in order to get a wheelbarrow or a wagon in here. It would be very tedious if I wasn't able to do that, because each year you're amending the beds, you're bringing in more soil, or you're harvesting, you're taking out plant material that needs to go to the compost pile. So you really need to make sure that your walkways are accessible to whatever tools and items that you're using. It's gonna make you a lot more efficient. In the in-ground garden, because there's no barriers with the beds, I don't need that 3-foot walkway. I can simply just wheel my wheelbarrow down, turn it, and just dump it into my rows if I'm needing to amend soil. Another thing in your raised bed garden, or really any garden, make sure that your gates are big enough to get in whatever it is that you're wanting to get in, because if you can't get it in here, then you can't use it. So like I mentioned earlier about water access, you'll want to make sure that you're close to a water source. But the biggest game changer for me was when we were able to install irrigation into the entire garden. I was spending between 3 to 4 hours a day just watering this garden. I would water the raised bed garden with a hose, and then I would use a sprinkler in my in-ground garden. And although it worked, it was extremely time consuming, and it led to a lot of disease and fungal issues on my plants. When you're watering from above and you're getting the foliage and the entire plant wet, what happens is it just creates a breeding ground for disease and fungus. And so if you can water from the bottom with a drip irrigation system like this is going to be the best thing for your plants. You'll end up getting a much better harvest because your plants will be healthier and you won't be fighting that disease or spending the time watering. You can devote your time to other things like weeding, harvesting, preserving. Now, if you do find yourself limited on space but still wanting to grow a significant amount of food, you'll want to think about vertical gardening. This can really increase the amount of food that you can grow substantially. I have some nice vertical tower green stalks up at my driveway that I harvest a really good amount of food on, considering how small of a footprint that they take up. But in the garden down here, we went ahead and these are really sad, but we just threw up some wood, attached it to the beds, and then we just used chicken wire. They're not the sturdiest trellis that I've ever seen, and we're hoping to fix that this year. We're hoping to put on some bigger wood pieces and actually use some cattle panels to trellis. Cattle panels are a great option because they're so sturdy. They're relatively inexpensive. They're about $30 for a 4-foot high by 16-foot long panel. And if you don't need that 16-foot long length, you can just cut them. Nate cuts them for me with a grinder, and then we just put them on wherever we need them. Here's another really simple way to trellis things. This is just a T-post. There's another T-post down that end, and then I just took baling twine. You could use yarn, you could use wire, whatever you want, and plant some plants right below that, and they will grow up it. This worked really well for me last year. Now you're gonna notice here that I do have some containers along the ground. These containers were just free. I just simply filled those with soil, and it gives me extra growing space. If you don't have access to containers, another thing that you might think of is just digging a hole in your ground and filling that hole with good soil and planting directly in that. I've also done that, and that works beautifully too. Now, the last thing that you'll want to consider when you are building a garden is fencing. Do you have deer? Do you have bunnies? We have a lot of deer pressure here, and so I knew that I was going to need a fence. So we got 8-foot T-posts, and we put them in the ground about 2 feet deep. And then we got an inexpensive roll of welded wire fence from Tractor Supply that's 4 feet tall. And we went ahead and attached it to the T-posts with zip ties. So a really quick way to get a fence up, fairly inexpensive. And then because I needed that extra height, I went ahead and put insulators on the tops of my T-posts, and I ran a string of electric wire, which I energized with a solar energizer from Premier One. Well, I hope you found that helpful. I hope that gives you some tips on what to think about when you're thinking about building a garden. It doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't have to be massive. Guys, I hope that this year is the year that you start a garden. You'll hedge yourself against that inflation at the grocery store, and you'll be feeding your family the best tasting food that you've ever had. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today, and we will see you in the next video.